What's in a name? With recipes, a lot can ride on what you call them. Welcome to Everything Cookbooks, the podcast for writers, readers, and cooks. I'm Kate Leahy, and today I'm here with Andrea and Kristin Donnelly, and Molly Stevens to talk recipe titles. For this episode, we thought we'd go back to our roots and geek out on a technical aspect of writing recipes, which is the title. We've talked to guests and we've talked to them about their process with recipe titles. And I know we have a lot to say on the subject, so let's just get straight into it. Hey, everyone.
Hey, Kate.
Hey, Kate. Hi, Kate.
So with recipe titles, this is something that I'm kind of curious to know how much time you all spend thinking about them when you're writing. But let's first look at when you're skimming through a book. How important are recipe titles? I mean, I could see for a lot of people thinking, I'm going to start looking at the photo and that's going to entice me to make something. But is it kind of sometimes like you go for the recipe title to make you figure out what you're going to make? Andrea, you want to kick it off?
You know, Kate, I guess it depends on how you read a cookbook, right? Do you read a cookbook visually through the photographs, or do you take a look at the words? And it also depends on the book itself. Is the book presenting, for example, like Chinese takeout recipes? So then I'm going to be looking at the recipe titles to see, I want to pick up recipes of things that I love at my Chinese restaurant. But if it's a modern cookbook, like what Carla Lalli Music presents, then, it's going to be a little bit different. It's going to be like her take. So I read them with different perspectives.
Good point. It really depends on if that subject is written, like you said, like the Chinese restaurant menu. You're going to look for your favorites, and that recipe title is really key. And if it's a different type of book, maybe it's more evocative. Maybe the recipe title is a secondary decision on whether you're going to be interested in that dish. I don't know, Molly, when you're reading a book, what do you think? How important are recipe titles?
Yeah, it's a great question. And I have to agree with Andrea. It depends on the book. Like if it's a single subject book, it's a pizza book, then all the recipes are, I'm assuming, going to be for pizza, or are they not? Or they're going to be for salads. So I think I tend to look at recipe titles. When I skim a book, I think that's what I'm looking at first. Glancing at the photos, but for me, it's more words. And I really do think chapter titles, which I know we're not really focusing on, but I think those are important as well, like how the book is organized. And then the first place I go, flipping through it, sure, but then I try to stop at the chapter openers and read the recipes in that chapter, because that sort of gives me a framework for, a roadmap for how it works. So for me, the recipe titles are very important. And I also, and I love that we're going to talk about this because it's so interesting how some are just really functional. And then others, I'm like, I don't know what that is. Like they're just evocative. They're just like grandmother's favorite soup. I don't know what that is, so it's just interesting to me how some recipe titles convey a lot of information and others are more mysterious. And is that deliberate or?
Right.
Well, I think of it like, am I reading the book for enjoyment, or am I actually ready to use it? Am I opening this book, cracking it because I want to find something that I'm going to make that day or next week or whatever? I think when I'm in that place where I'm ready, when I want to use the book and find a recipe to cook, that's where the titles are so important, because it often does start with what ingredients do I have on hand, or what just sounds really good to me right now. Whereas I think when I'm reading, maybe I don't pay as much attention, to be honest. It's probably, I think, more of a combination of things that grab me. That's where it's the photo combined with the title and the head note.
I don't know if you remember the gourmet cookbook that came out a long time ago, the big yellow.
Yeah.
Gourmet
The yellow titles.
The yellow titles where you couldn't read the titles.
And I don't mean to bring it up because I'm sure it's a sore subject for people who worked on that book, but it reminded me how much I rely on the titles, because flipping through that book was very difficult for me because the titles were in this yellow print for listeners who haven't seen it, and they faded. They were hard to see. They sort of receded when you were flipping through it. So it was just an indication for me how much design elements make the title either stand out or recede. It was just a reminder for me how much I do rely on those titles as I flip through.
Right.
What about you, Kate?
When I'm looking through a book and I'm in that situation where, I'm in the kitchen and I just want to find something I want to make either now or tomorrow after I go to the grocery store or whatnot, I sometimes am looking at titles as like, where are the vetoes? Like, oh, I don't have those ingredients, or I'm not interested in those flavor combinations. And sometimes the title is kind of a way to say, all right, the picture looks great, but maybe that's just not for me at this moment. So sometimes a title can help just kind of, sort through recipes that you actually do want to make, even if the photo is great. It's like, it's going to take this recipe. Maybe it's like a 12 egg something or other, and I don't want to use my dozen eggs for that at this moment, but maybe down the road. It's kind of one of those things. But honestly, I think I'm going to learn a lot from all of you on recipe titles, because I feel like this is a hard one. Sometimes, especially when you're working in a co-author capacity, it can be difficult to figure out the right way to balance the creative side of what the author's trying to, get people excited about with the practical. And that's where I'm in the kitchen. I want to figure out what to make. Maybe I don't want an evocative title that's going to pull me out and think I've got to take too long to figure out if I can actually pull this off today. So I think there's that balancing act, and it might, as like Andrea, you said, it really depends on the subject of the book. So I thought before we get into how we write great recipe titles, I thought it would be kind of fun to go back in history a little bit and see where we've come with recipe titles, because cookbooks have changed a lot. I feel like in the past 5 years, they've really accelerated and changed and evolved. But there's been some kind of crazy cool titles for the last 100 years. So this is going to be something different. I'm going to say a recipe title. I'm going to say the year and where it came from. And I want you all to tell me, what do you think this recipe was all about? All right, this is in the Wayback Machine. We're going 1896. Boston Cooking School, and that was what ended up becoming the whole Fanny Farmer series later. This book had a recipe for chicken a la Stanley. So, what do you guys think that was?
Who is Stanley?
A la. I love the a la. Chicken a la Stanley.
So here's what I think. The chicken was pounded really thin, and it inspired Flat Stanley, which is that cardboard cutout that elementary school children sometimes get and send all over the place.
I have done Flat Stanley for my niece decades ago.
Oh my gosh.
That's funny.
That is...
No, I'm totally kidding. I have no idea what it is.
Well, I actually know what it is only because I've seen the book, but I think what's amazing is when you do see it, there's no explanation. There's no head note beyond. And I think recipe titles and head notes, relate to each other, but it's just chicken a la Stanley and then falls into the recipe.
So everyone knew at that time who Stanley was.
At least what it was. It's kind of like fettuccine Alfredo, I guess. It's like...
But at least Alfredo vaguely sounds like culturally it would go with fettuccine. But Stanley...
A la.
A la.
All right, so here's what the recipe was for. Again, who knows who Stanley was, but it is a recipe for chicken with an onion cream sauce. So there you have it.
I guess the a la is a French reference, because that sounds like a sort of a French dish, onion cream sauce. But Stanley, I don't know. It's very strange. Very strange.
Well, circling back to the idea that a recipe ought to be enticing, evocative, and tempting. Yeah. Maybe they figured like the a la part and made it seem fanciful, dinner party worthy. And Stanley, whoever Stanley was, made it like super special. You go, oh, voila, here is chicken a la Stanley.
Because we had chicken a la King last time. So, well, if anyone out there knows the source, like who Stanley was or what this dish was all about, let us know. Okay, we're moving on to our next recipe. This one is from 1943. We have a book called Cook It in a Casserole, and the recipe is codfish Neapolitan. Anyone have any clue what a codfish Neapolitan recipe would entail?
A layered pasta dish with codfish, which sounds so gross to me versus just calling it cod, but that's my 2023 brain.
Yeah, saying codfish as opposed to just cod is not something we'd hear today.
Neapolitan. I think of like pizza or something. Pizza-like flavors. I don't know.
You would think like tomatoes would play a role.
Basil.
But in this cookbook, Cook It in a Casserole.
I was going to say, Cook It in a Casserole is not a bad book title.
I would love to write a casserole cookbook because I think there are casseroles all over the world. And I'm going to keep codfish Neapolitan in mind, but just kind of, modernize the name a bit.
All right. So I think, Andrea, you can improve on this, but codfish Neapolitan is spaghetti, cod, white sauce. There's no sub recipe for white sauce. You're supposed to know how to make that. Breadcrumbs, grated cheese, and butter. That's the recipe.
Cooked in a casserole.
Cook it in a casserole. So you're just kind of like overcooking cod.
Overcooked. Yeah, I was going to say, so it cooks forever. Oh my gosh, it's gross.
It's your next potluck contribution.
It's a cod spaghetti pie with bechamel.
Do you think this was like the original tuna casserole?
Yeah, there you go.
Yeah, there you go. All right, so now we're fast forwarding in time. We are in 1957. This is a Sunset magazine cookbook, and it's called Cooking Bold and Fearless, Recipes by Chefs of the West. This recipe, I actually really like this name. I think it sounds kind of modern. It's called Unelaborate Onion Soup.
Oh, I love that name.
Yeah. So if we were to title it today, it'd be what, like
No fuss.
fast and easy, down and dirty onion soup?
Weeknight.
Cheaters.
Yes. So what is it, Kate?
The unelaborate part is that instead of using a bouillon or consomme for the base, so instead of making a frickin' consomme for the soup, you just make a beef stock and then you conveniently leave the beef in it rather than taking it out. And this is the unelaborate onion soup. And I'm thinking, this assumes a lot of the home cook, that you already know how to make consomme, that you would be taking beef out so you have disposable income, like what happens to that beef. So unelaborate onion soup is a pretty advanced cookbook then.
Are you still caramelizing the onions?
I mean, yeah, it has onions.
Because with onion
so
soup, sometimes that's like so much of the work,
Right.
This all sounds like it's very elaborate to me and assumes that you have money and time to invest.
Yes.
I would use instant bouillon. I thought that was the unelaborate.
Yeah, I mean, the unelaborate onion soups of my youth were cans of Campbell's beef bouillon.
Although it's Sunset, right? I mean, it's 1957, so a lot of convenience products, but I imagine Sunset didn't do that very often.
Cooking Bold and Fearless, another great title.
I know. And the compilation of cooks who have written into Sunset from all over the West Coast. It's a cute book also. We're going to fast forward another several years. This book is 1978. It's called The Book of Yogurt, and it's by an author named Sonia Uvezian, who is one of the original really great Armenian cookbook authors. This book, it's interesting. It's a mix of westernized names and regional names. For example, I don't even know if I should quiz you on this because I'm not sure I can pronounce this name, but it's Gevetcht, which
sounds Yiddish.
is probably not correct. Sorry, anyone who speaks Romanian, but it says it's a Romanian fish casserole. So I'm sorry I'm on this fish casserole kick, apparently.
Wow.
I don't remember what it is. I just remember the name. So I won't even quiz you on that one. But Andrea, I think you dug up a great 1980s reference since we did it 70s. Now we're going 80s. And I think this is when things started to change in cookbooks. All of a sudden, people were really looking at the broader world of cuisine. There was no more Stanleys by the 70s and 80s. But what we did have was nouvelle cuisine, right?
Yes. And we had big shoulder pads and fusion. So I pulled a book off my shelf by Michael Roberts, published in 1988, called Secret Ingredients. Opened up the book, landed on a recipe for goat cheese lasagna with eggplant. What do y'all think that was about?
Was the eggplant standing in for the pasta?
It was in addition.
Chris and I had the same thought, the whole layering, tower, architectural style of chef cooking that really blown up in the 80s. But also lasagna, stood for something. And now suddenly lasagna could stand for anything, right? It's a lasagna. You could just call a dish lasagna. Before, it could be a lasagna, and that could be the whole recipe. And now it's qualified by goat cheese, and it's including eggplant, which you might not normally associate. Rules are breaking.
It is. And what he does is Roberts combines eggplant parmigiana and lasagna. So today he'd say eggplant parm and lasagna together in one casserole.
Sounds good.
The noodles are there. And he says you got to use strong goat cheese because it's a catalyst of flavor. And you've got rosemary in there. And there's also yogurt.
Oh.
You're layering the noodles, eggplant, cheese, and rosemary. And you're repeating that to make your layers in your casserole. And then the sauce.
Chopped raw rosemary?
What he's saying is that you want the rosemary, yogurt, tomatoes, and eggplant and garlic to combine to create the fresh character of the dish.
So it's raw garlic, raw rosemary.
Well, the sauce is tomato, white wine, and garlic that you cook together. So the garlic isn't raw.
I got it. So it's got a red sauce.
Yeah.
And yogurt.
You make the red sauce. You remove the red sauce from the heat and you whisk in the yogurt.
Ah.
Okay,
He's an extremely creative cook. One of the best in terms of fusion ideas in the 80s. It was just like brilliant. So he doesn't want so much fat, but he wants, that tang, but some richness. I don't know. It sounds like, you could really do something with it.
I love catalyst of flavor. That's a really great descriptor. But I do think we could workshop a better name for this recipe because goat cheese lasagna with eggplant does not do it justice.
No, I call it eggplant parm lasagna.
Totally. That would go viral.
Yeah.
Would you call it tangy eggplant parm lasagna? So you've introduced this. The tangy would bring in the yogurt and the goat cheese.
True. How about goaty eggplant parm?
Goaty. No, you can't say goaty.
No, how about, you could do the goat cheese lasagna a la
Mike.
I love Mike.
Oh, great.
That's great.
And I'll round out the 1990s. Again, things are evolving. There's more chef cookbooks coming out. This one, I'm not even going to quiz you on because it's pretty obvious by the name. But I thought the way that the recipe was written was interesting because in the 1999 Chez Panisse Cafe cookbook, there's a recipe that's called aioli, and in parentheses, garlic mayonnaise. And then the head note, it doesn't bother telling you what aioli is because it's already done that in the name of the recipe. So I thought that was pretty interesting. And I bet future Chez Panisse books used aioli and they just didn't even bother with the garlic mayonnaise explainer.
Right. I mean, you could really follow the arc of when dishes were generally accepted by, can you just use that name in a recipe title or does it need a descriptor?
Interesting. And then, fast forward to, I guess, the past couple of decades, past decade. Molly, you have a couple of examples.
Yeah, I was thinking about, and I think we've touched on this already in this conversation, about how recipe titles in books often reflect what's happening in restaurants as well, because it just reflects our general cooking sensibilities. And I was flipping through Diane Henry's Change of Appetites, came out in 2014. And it just struck me is that the recipe titles are not so much titles as listing of what's in the dish. And I think that's happened so much on restaurant menus. So here, I'll give you two examples from Change of Appetite. Hot smoked salmon, rye, beet, and radish salad. And you almost need to say where the commas are in there because it's hot smoked salmon, comma, rye, comma, beet, and radish salad. So it's a simple lineup of, I mean, not every ingredient. It doesn't say the salt and pepper and the olive oil and everything else, but the flavors that are going to really hit. Here's another one. Broiled summer herb mackerel, comma, mushrooms, and green veg. It's straightforward. And I think we see this, I mean, I know we saw this in Ali Slagle's book. I'm trying to think of some of the other recent guests we've had on that we've talked to who just sort of the lineup of the high points of what's in the dish.
And Nigel Slater does that.
Exactly, yeah.
Heidi Swanson used to do that.
I like the green veg, the very casual use of that too. It's fun.
Yeah.
You get the main ingredients. You can read that and get an idea, even without seeing a photo, what that dish probably is going to come together and look like. So yeah, that is pretty important. I think this is something that actually you see in style guides for publishers. They say, avoid using somebody's name for a recipe title. Like don't call it Diane's chocolate chip cookies unless you really want it to be connected with Diane. You're going to explain who that Diane character is. I mean, we can argue whether that's right or wrong, but I think that's something that we've seen. Like they're kind of like, don't have to tie this to like grandma's favorite soup because no one knows your grandma. No one knows what her favorite soup was. But if it said grandma's favorite minestrone soup, then you can, I know what minestrone is. I know this is a minestrone soup recipe.
I was just going to say with the Diana Henry, because sometimes restaurant menus will be so spare where it's literally like, it won't even say salad. It'll just say like hot smoked salmon plus rye plus beet plus radish or something. Or,
But it's under the salad category on the menu. So you're like, oh, that's a salad.
Right. Yeah. But I could even just see it being like mackerel plus mushrooms plus green veg or something. And this at least tells you it's broiled and there's some herbs. I feel like it gives a little more than some restaurant menus
Yeah, that's a good point.
I would like to someday be able to write my Asian recipe titles in that manner.
Yeah.
But for the time being, I can't because there are certain things that I need to cover and what people are looking for. And if I go a descriptive route. I'm afraid that they wouldn't necessarily understand what that was. Now, if I were a restaurant chef and I titled my menu items that way and I did a cookbook, then I think that I would feel liberated, more comfortable in presenting something in that manner. But otherwise, I struggle so much with recipe titles because I'm oftentimes presenting them in a bilingual manner. And sometimes I'm working in like 3 or 4 different Asian languages in one book. So I have to be very, very careful.
Let's talk about that a little bit. I mean, that's one of the big changes in the past few years is how recipe titles have evolved to allow for more of the representative names rather than getting something sort of written for English language speakers only. But it's a balancing act, right? Because if it's an unfamiliar dish to someone, are they going to skim it and not actually look at that recipe? So, Andrea, I know this is something for all your books. It's been that balancing act. Can you give us some examples of what you've done in your book that's coming out this year?
So in Vietnamese Food Any Day, I did not have any Vietnamese titles in the recipe titles. There were no Vietnamese names. And like the Viet people complained to me and they're like, I would really love to know what that dish is in Vietnamese so that I can skim the book and know what dish it is. And I said, well, here's my problem. I created a no churn Vietnamese coffee ice cream. How do I translate that into Vietnamese? And then they said, oh, okay. But I realized like in Evergreen Vietnamese that's coming out in April 2023 that I just wanted to go all in and have a Vietnamese recipe title for every single recipe. Whether I created it, developed something new and modern, I was going to figure out a way to have a Vietnamese name to do justice to the cuisine. And what I realized is that I, as a writer, have become more confident in my writing abilities and understanding the nuances of Vietnamese culinary terms. So it's something that I really, really worked on for Evergreen Vietnamese. There's a fast vegetarian pho in there. And I was like, oh my God, how am I going to title that? So I just did a literal translation into Vietnamese, pho chai nhan, which is fast vegetarian pho. Because it's always this thing of how do I present it, going forward and backwards. And then because it's a book that has vegetarian, non-vegetarian recipes. So, for example, there is a recipe for green papaya salad. The main recipe has this beef jerky in it, but then there's a variation for a vegetarian version. And so I just was like, all right, I'm just going to call it what it is in Vietnamese in the main recipe title, and then slide the vegetarian name into the head note somewhere. And so it's always this kind of thing where I'm just trying to maneuver Vietnamese terms so that my Vietnamese readers understand what they're getting. And when it got to layout, we had a South Asian American woman design, and she said, may I put the Vietnamese names for the recipes first and then the English one. For many years, decades, the foreign title was always below the English title. But I think this is a power issue and it's an identity issue. It's a cultural pride issue. And now we're seeing them switched. Yeah, they're a little bit smaller in terms of the weight, but the colors are still vivid so that they stand equally, and they are both presented in the table of contents at the front of the book, not just the English terms.
That's cool.
Wow.
So there's all of that kind of stuff, this realignment culturally in cuisine that's happening in book publishing, and it's very, very exciting for me because, I'm not a fluent Vietnamese speaker, and when I look through a Vietnamese cookbook, I'm also skimming for the recipe titles. I do the same thing in my limited understanding of Chinese.
I thought it was interesting when we spoke with Eric Kim. He really spent a lot of time deciding when to use an English word, when to use a Korean word, or at least an English spelling of a Korean word. The stress or the little bit of agony that sometimes provoked, because it's will people know what it is? But then will there also be, like he said, sometimes he gets a lot of flack from Koreans who are like, that's not this dish, because it's not the way their grandmother made it.
Right.
So that anxiety about updating something.
Exactly. And for something like nuc jam, the dipping sauce, for many years I was calling it multi-purpose dipping sauce. So boring. So boring. But this time around for Evergreen Vietnamese, I was just nuc jam dipping sauce. I'm not ready to just call it nukdum. So I'm still in the Chez Panisse 1999 era.
Garlic mayonnaise.
Yeah, but my dipping sauce is not in parens. I'm just like straight up right there, folks.
You're absolutely right. It's a power issue. And historically has been where the anglicized, the English name was front and center, and then maybe italics or parentheses or not at all would be the original name. And I was just flipping through Rick Martinez Mi Cocina, his new book about Mexican food, and all the recipe titles are in Spanish. Afterwards, there'll be a descriptor, much like it used to be. Afterwards would be the italics with the Spanish. Afterwards is a descriptor in English, in American English, that explains what the recipe is, even before the head note. So it really is shifting, and it's interesting what you say, Andrea, like having them both appear as well in the table of contents. And we could also talk about indexing too, because I think recipe titles and indexing is they're obviously very related, interconnected. And if you have the best recipe titles in the world, then if they're not properly indexed, your readers can't find your way around either. So
really good point. We touched on this a little bit when Kristin and I talked to Anna Voloshna about her book Budmo. She includes the English spelling of the names of the recipe, and she spells borscht the way that the Russians spell it and not the Ukrainians. And that's kind of one of those things where you can know how you pronounce it and spell it, in Ukrainian, in Russian, but then it translates. And I think you see this a lot with in Arabic languages too, and Chinese, like just the spellings, the English spellings of dishes, even really common dishes, vary so much that sometimes you're not sure if this is the same recipe. And so balancing out all these, it's great that we're moving forward, but it's one of those things that if you see a cookbook and somebody has spelled a dish that most people know and they spell it a different way, maybe there's an E instead of an I or a Y instead of something, like give the author some slack. It's like there's not like a template that says this is how you always spell. For example, in Egypt, there is a well-known dish called molokhia. And molokhia, it's an Arabic word. I have seen this dish spelled so many times that I'm not sure what is the best way to spell it in English. It doesn't really matter to Arabic speakers. They're going to spell it in Arabic. So, getting those translations and getting those, if it's an E, is it a P, is it a B? Does it really matter if the sound kind of comes across? It's challenging. Like, Andrea, what do you do with those different types of challenges?
Right. So one of the things that you want to be careful if you're going to go to a different language and present them in the titles, especially when you are not a native speaker. Well, even if you are, because folks, it wakes me up in the middle of the night if I don't have the right accent marks, those little diacritics. For example, with Chinese, you have Chinese characters. And within Chinese characters, there are traditional Chinese characters and what are called simplified. So simplified Chinese characters have fewer strokes. Then within those two, there are different ways of romanizing Chinese. So their standard is pinyin, which is what's used on the mainland China. But then what if you have Cantonese in there? And what if there's some other dialect that you're using? You have to be very, very careful in presenting consistently throughout your book. One system. If you're going to go pinyin all the way. Like in my books with Vietnamese language, if I'm unsure, I will lean towards Northern Vietnamese because that's standard. And if it's a Southern Vietnamese dish, then I will present it in Southern Vietnamese because we have different words for the same ingredients or the same dish. But I think that people look for authority. And we talked to Kenji Lopez about this in cookbook authoring with regard to cuisine. And so, you want to be careful with foreign terms. And if you're unsure, skip it all the way through because I am not a Chinese character expert. I would have to have that proofread separately. But for folks like the Walks of Life, the Leung family, they have Chinese characters, then they have pinyin, which is Mandarin, and then they have the English name. It's 3 levels of proofreading that has to happen. Yeah. And you got to be careful.
You could say croque monsieur forever and leave it in there. And that's a French word. But because so much of our cookbook canon legacy in the US is westernized, you could say that, but you couldn't use a equally common, Vietnamese term and leave it in there. That would need to be explained. And so back to Andrea's point about how, it's been a power thing and is changing and evolving in good ways. But let's not forget that it was okay to use Italian and French and the occasional, German word that was widely accepted and known, but not any of the other.
That just takes us so far from chicken a la Stanley in 1896. I mean, this is a whole level. The care that's being put into recipe names has become tremendously more intricate and more advanced. And I think that's something that as recipe writers, you can kind of take that for granted, but I think it's something to be aware of going forward. Let's look forward just in general about tips for writing better recipe titles. I know, Kristin, you have been thinking a lot about how to write recipe titles, whether it's coaching new authors or working as a co-author. What are certain tips that you want to share?
Well, I was also thinking like in a book, how you want to vary a lot of times your recipe structure, I guess, unless you don't, maybe you want to do a whole book where it is that Diana Henry style. And I think that can work, but I also think having variety is nice. So yeah, when I did a recipe writing workshop recently, and I just did a list of suggestions for things to pull from for recipe titles, and it's by no means comprehensive, but yummy adjectives. I don't even use the word yummy usually, but you know what I mean, things that make it sound really tasty. Specific ingredients that bring a lot of flavor. So I've done like miso, molasses, baked beans before. With those specific ingredients, you get a sense of what that might taste like. Crediting the creator. I know you said about how that can be tricky, but I think sometimes it is appealing. And Anna had that grandma's roast duck. We know it's a roast duck recipe. So,
right.
Or Ken's fried rice in the Rice's Life book I worked on. Using a method, you said broiled before, red wine braised, for example. This has become very popular in the past decade or so. And I think this is where it's like tread carefully, the naming something after a widely appealing dish. So like the eggplant parmesan lasagna, I think that sounds really appealing because people love those dishes. I've seen like faro carbonara before. If you put that on social media, that'll probably spark a lot of comments. Like, that's not carbonara. If you're a purist, you want to see carbonara done a certain way. So
cauliflower risotto was...
Oh, totally. Cauliflower rice even.
Yes,
just
exactly.
calling it that. I think it can be okay, but I think you also sometimes have to be prepared for backlash. It can also come back to power. And it's like, are you the person who should be developing a recipe called a certain thing?
Like a strawberry Bellini. A Bellini is a peach drink. If you made it a strawberry, you would call it a strawberry Bellini.
A croissant made out of puff pastry dough.
Right. Like, is that okay?
Yeah.
Right.
Speaking to ease. So what was it before? Not unelaborate?
Unelaborate onion soup.
Yeah.
Unelaborate. I really like that. I think that would be a one worth bringing back. And maybe there's other things in that book that we can mine. I just like that idea of unelaborate. Of course, you could probably have to rewrite that particular recipe to make it unelaborate. But
yeah, totally. But like low maintenance grilled chicken or weeknight. Romantic titles, I think, can be fun. I remember there was the Sicilian lifeguard salad that I think ran in Food and Wine at some point. And then superlatives, best, whatever. But I think that's another place where you have to be very careful, use sparingly, because if everything's the best ever, then what really is,
Mm-hmm.
You're overpromising then.
It's a great list.
Yeah, that is a great list. We can put that on Instagram too, so people can have that little list running.
Sure.
And just remember, you can always rewrite recipe titles. So if you look at your whole list and you're using certain words over again, just like we've said with head notes, just trim, edit. You can go from there.
I'm always like at the very last minute, I feel like changing a title, or there's titles I would change too. I mean, we can talk about that, but
yeah. Which ones?
I think I like overgeneralized, especially in my book, Modern Potluck. Sometimes there's a 7-layer salad and I use like a yogurt sauce in it and toasted spices and a few other things, but I called it like Middle Eastern 7-layer salad. And I feel like it's just way too general. What does that mean? There's stuff like that where I'm like, I would change that now. I feel like it was presumptuous.
Mm-hmm.
Okay. Molly, do you have any titles that you wish you could go back and rewrite?
I am sure I do. I am sure I do. And I think about one of the biggest challenges in writing titles with single subject books, which are two of my biggest books, is that everything in the braised book is braised. Mm-hmm. So is every title going to be red wine braised, white wine braised, soy braised, that sort of thing? So that's a unique challenge if you're writing a single subject book, I think. You just have to work and wordsmith. Yeah, there's a scallop recipe in my braising book that's Vietnamese style. is as simple as I say. It's a wonderful recipe. I'm very happy with the recipe. It's been a popular one, but I'm not sure I would have called it that. I don't know what I would have called it. Would I have called it co-style, which is the style? I probably would have called up Andrea and we would have had a conversation about it. I might have said soy, brown sugar braised, and then explained it or something. It just similar to, I think, Kristin, what you're saying. It's too general. That whole hyphen style, using a food from a different country and just calling it the style of that, when I really don't have any personal firsthand, except I've been making the dish for a long time. So I think I would have dug deeper and worked harder on that title. Is one example.
Right.
The hyphenation thing, you can use hyphenations in really cool ways now, I feel. For example, in Evergreen Vietnamese, I have this pho recipe that originally it was chicken and vegetable pho, because you're using vegetables to build umami, and that allows you to use less chicken. The book's about low meat eating and vegetarian cooking and celebrating the ways Vietnamese people use vegetables. And I came up with this recipe through a lot of trial and error. And I was like, but it sounded so boring, like chicken and vegetable pho. I was like, how do I sell that to people who come over in my house, right? So what I did was I just said chicken vegetable pho, and I dropped the and I inserted a hyphen, and I used that. And you see that in modern recipes now at titles nowadays, where you insert that hyphen and it allows you to create this kind of funny compound word of sorts.
Gives it more energy sometimes.
Exactly. Thank you.
With
Thank
less
you.
space, it just gives your people skimming, their eyes aren't going to be as tired having to read a long list of ingredients or something. Yeah. Or get bored by chicken and vegetable.
And you don't want to say and.
Exactly. And so like sometimes then I have this other recipe that I worked through, this cake recipe. It's a Vietnamese coffee cake, but it's essentially a mocha cake. It's a cake that tastes exactly like Vietnamese coffee. And I baked it like 30, 40 times before I got it right. Anyway, I had like 5 different names. I asked my mom about it. I asked my sister about it. They tasted it. And my mom was like, I like your Vietnamese coffee cake. And I was like, I don't know if I can call it that, because it's going to be, like people think it's like an American coffee cake. And in the end, I called it bánh mocha in Vietnamese, because I didn't know what to call it. I couldn't translate it as like Vietnamese coffee cake. So there were all of these like little dances, intellectual dances that you do when you're presenting things in different languages, but it's also fun. So I just want to encourage, everyone that these are these fun cultural puzzles that we can do with language when we write cookbooks.
And fun in titles in general, too. I think there's a lot of room for fun in recipe titles.
Absolutely.
Yeah, I remember I had fun doing like in Modern Potluck, I have like it's like a potato salad with like fennel and pickly things or something like that. Like I did try to have some lighthearted titles.
Right. And then you can mix and match. Like I think we talked to Andy Baragani about that, Andrea, about how he would have a Persian name, a very, very Persian recipe. And then next to it would be something that seemed, it could be in the pages of Bon Appetit that would have like more of an Italian flair, but it would have like maybe that pickly things kind of note. And you can have those in the same book. I think you just need to be careful that you're not losing the reader when you're doing it. Like they're along the ride for you. And you can do that with maybe interspersing, essays like Andy does in his book, which I think really help kind of give the context for why he's putting this dish where he does in the book. So the role of recipe titles, it looks like you can be descriptive, evocative, provocative, original, educational, and you can also just be user-friendly too. So you can still be user-friendly with your recipes. You don't have to be poetic with everyone either. Any pet peeves we should leave people with?
I once read this very long essay in a food anthropology book about the word crispy. And anytime people see crispy, they just go gaga over it. It's like on a menu, crispy cauliflower. People are like, I got to order that. So I thought about it, and I use crispy in certain titles in my cookbooks, but I never want to say crispy and then not fully deliver on crispy. Right?
Yeah.
Because I see it sometimes, like people are like crispy shrimp, and it's like kind of crispy chewy, because shrimp cooked in its shell is never really crispy. And I don't know if I really want to eat a crispy shell and shrimp, because that could be crunchy hard.
Yeah.
And scrape the roof of my mouth. And so I always, when I see the word crispy, I'm like, is it really crispy in like a positive way? Or is it crispy in like a not so crispy way? And they're just trying to like recipe bait me? A recipe title bait me.
That's so funny.
Incinerated shrimp. That should be the name of a crispy shrimp recipe. What about length? Do you guys have strong opinions on length with recipe titles?
I feel like you feel it. Like you feel when it feels too long, I guess.
Yeah, I'm always reading my recipe titles aloud. And then when it comes down to length, actually you see it in layout. Because, you see it in design, and when first pages come out and all of a sudden your typeface is set to a particular size. And if there's like one word that drops down to the second line and it's just sitting there and it's taken up way too much space, you want to go back and change it. I do anyway, so that it fits on one line.
Right? Yeah. It's just trying to figure out what are the key words. And, I think thinking of what chapter it's in does help me a lot. Like if it's in the salad chapter, maybe it doesn't have to say it's a salad every time. It probably does because you're not, if it's an herb salad, what are you going to say? Bowl of herbs? I mean, maybe,
Tossed herbs.
I don't know, maybe a heap of herbs. That one could be, depending on the book.
Heap of herbs.
But, yeah.
I like it.
But overly descriptive, I think, I don't want to say it's a pet peeve, but I get lost. I want something that is concise, that the author has done the work and figured out, what is the arrangement. It's something you said, Kate, earlier about the veto. As a recipe title writer, I think there's also this veto thing where prunes. So I've got a chicken with lemon and prunes, very classic combination. Do I put prunes in the title? Because some people still get turned off by the word prunes, or the classic anchovy one, or fish sauce, or whatever the things that certain people have aversion to. Do you drop them out of the title because you think that's going to be a veto? Or do you actually leave it in there? And then your head note is, don't tell your anchovy hating friends that it's in this dish, But so I'm not really isolating a pet peeve here, but I'm just saying that there's such power in the words that we choose.
Yeah.
And Kristin, you said how you keep changing them. To the very end. I remember driving back when I had to FedEx some pages back and like pulling it out, having to get a new FedEx box because at the last minute I changed one last title.
Oh my God.
Yeah.
Oh.
I think with something like prunes or those, I'm more and more leaning toward you put them in because I feel like those ingredients have the people who love them,
Absolutely. Bold and fearless. Let's go back to whatever.
Yeah.
No, but I meant to say I'm more in favor of including those and being less afraid. And if that's really an element of the dish that stands out, and this is a way, the goat cheese is a catalyst. So put it in the title.
Yeah.
Right. Just don't change the names after your book has been indexed.
Oof.
So
True.
One quick thing about indexing, right? If you want to see, how your recipes are going to look in an index, I know I will do that when I'm doing recipe research. I will go to the index first before I flip through a book to see, I want to look at the bean recipes, and the index will usually have beans, and then the recipes that have beans will be listed under it. So that's another thing. If you're not really sure how to write this recipe, think of how people are going to find it. That can also maybe trick you into using fewer words than you think you need to use. So yeah, index, I know we were going to talk about that. I feel like we can maybe do that for another episode because I think we covered it for now. Any parting words you want to leave our listeners with?
Just check them and check them again. If it's a cookbook, check them, as it goes, the final passes, because little changes, did the photo match the recipe title? If you have access to the index, is the hamburger recipe listed under ham or is it listed under beef? I've seen it listed under ham.
Whoa.
That's a problem. So
That's
just,
interesting.
Recipe titles have power.
Yeah.
They do. And yeah, we can talk about indexing till I'm blue in the face. Yeah, you don't want to change recipe titles when you're in like second pages because it flows through the entire book. You better get really good with that search and find and replace thing to flag them for folks. But there are always more recipe titles to write. So, that's what I always think.
Yep.
This is just a niggly thing, and hyphens versus N dashes versus M dashes. And I still sometimes am unclear when to. I'm kind of clear, but I also don't.
I'm never
know how to
clear.
make them.
I'll be honest. Yeah. I'm sure mine are half the time they're done wrong.
I got the answer, you guys.
Okay, please share.
I emailed the 10 Speed Press production manager, Doug Ogan, he wrote me back like, excellent question. And he said, the difference is you use a hyphen when it's a singular word. You use an N dash if it's a compound word. So 2 words emphasizing like one thing. So New York style pizza, you would use an N dash between the York and style. But hyphen if it's Chicago style pizza, because it's only one word.
Okay.
Oh.
Mhm.
Oh.
Yeah.
Okay. This is why I'm not a copy editor, everyone. The mystery has been solved. Awesome.
Well, thank you for that.
They both have great power in recipe titles, and they allow you to use, fewer words. And we could talk about punctuation in recipe titles as well, but we'll save that.
Well,
maybe we'll get a copy editor on and we'll edit.
Oh, God.
school
Yes.
us all.
Exactly. And we can
Indexer.
ask all our questions and
Yes.
show how little that we understand sometimes. Well, I did promise this episode we were going to be geeky. We were going to nerd out a little bit. And I think we have accomplished all of
You
that.
delivered.
Thanks, everyone, for listening. We'll be back after a few weeks off with a whole new lineup of episodes and more great guest interviews with some new fun content. So stay tuned for that. Thank you all for joining me today for this great conversation. And I look forward to more of these deep dive nerdy chats this year.
Thanks, Kate.
Thank you, Kate.
Thanks, Kate.
Thanks for listening. As always, we are happy to have you in our community of listeners. If you have a comment or question you'd like us to answer, contact us through our website, everythingcookbooks.com. If you like what you hear, please leave us a review on Amazon Music, Apple Podcasts, or wherever you listen. Any book mentioned on the show can be found on our affiliate page at bookshop.org. Thanks, as always, to our brilliant editor, Abby Cirquitella. Until next time, keep on writing, reading, and cooking.